I was still making last-minute changes to the presentation because it could go in so many different directions. And so I've kind of steered away from maybe mechanistic changes in muscle, but I would love, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to discuss it. And just to describe sort of the general overview on my idea of muscle, why I'm interested in studying muscle health in an aging population. I'd like to say it's the end of term, but I've got everything under control, but the sinus infection voice kind of gives it away. So I'll have to go between two options. I have Halls here, but then I'll have it in my mouth and I'll be rattling around when I'm talking to you, or I'll be having to stop every couple of seconds for a sip of water, so we'll play that by ear. At any rate, this is really a sort of a central theme in my laboratory, is to investigate the importance of muscle health and its link with other parameters of physiological function. My background, educational background, biology and exercise physiology is my background, and so it's with that sort of slant that I'm looking at this importance of muscle health. I should have brought a clicker, but I'll just use this. I'll talk a little bit, and as I'm actually bringing up this slide, I'm realizing I didn't make the last minute changes, but I'll talk a little bit about the couple of key terms that I use in terms of muscle, the amount of muscle or the quantity of muscle, the changes that occur in terms of the quality of muscle, and that's something that maybe is less appreciated, but increasingly being recognized as being important. The terms used to describe these kinds of changes with age and with disease. We'll talk a little bit about mitochondrial dysfunction. This is where I might deviate a little bit from the original plan and lead into some of my investigations on causes of mitochondrial dysfunction. But really I'll spend also more time now talking about some interventions and what our future plans are, and hopefully generate a little bit of excitement in that regard. So I thought at first, even though, and I was thrilled to squeak in at the end of the term. Unfortunately, normally I would teach during at this time period, but last class was on Tuesday, so I said, yes, I can come on your very last session. It's a time that I could make. But I thought, I'm sure this has been a discussion around the table of, well, aging, what is aging? What do we consider older adults, even when we use that term? This is one possibility that if I'm talking about aging, I could be talking about individuals such as these two women here. This is another possibility, but certainly these guys down here would agree, yeah, these people are old, but they would also agree that a 10-year-old's pretty old as well. So it's all a little bit relative in terms of aging. But really, because my interest is in muscle health, I have particular interest in sort of middle age to older to certainly the oldest of the old individuals that have been recruited as subjects, and strength and muscle mass has been determined. And so I've become increasingly interested now, and I'll sort of near the end talk about a research study that's about to start any day, looking at middle-aged group and older, and to document those changes. A bit of an understudied group, and I'm becoming increasingly interested in this group, not for any personal reason, for academic reasons, and for personal reasons. So we'll talk a little bit. So today what I'm talking about aging, and really a lot of the work has been done, usually they recruit individuals that are certainly above 55, but usually it's 65 and up. But really some interesting information comes from those individuals that are 80 years and older. So it's been long recognized that good muscle function is important for longevity. You might be familiar with studies or results that say, strength is an important indicator, and even something as simple as a measurement of grip strength. And I say that's simple because there can be far more sophisticated techniques to look at changes in angle and velocity of movement of your leg, etc. But a simple handheld dynamometer that is portable, that you can take into a hospital, take into a community center, that will assess grip strength, has the association between that strength determined in that way by a hand grip dynamometer is largely related to a person's morbidity, mortality, etc. So the idea of strength and muscle, that's not controversial. There's a high correlation between that and an individual's longevity. But we sometimes sort of think, I think, and certainly it's the focus of a lot of courses, I would say, in our faculty that are geared towards the physiologies, that we think of muscle, this is what's helping us get around. This is what's going to achieve our goals in terms of performance, in terms of athletics. We need a certain amount of strength. This is what we need to run fast. This is what we need to lift. This is what we need to throw far. We think of muscle in terms of that functional capacity. But it has lots of important roles beyond just movement and mobility. And that's kind of what I'm going to interject as we kind of go along today. That it has some endocrine functions, so hormonal functions. There are markers, are chemicals that are secreted from muscle that play a role in inflammation or response to damage. The muscle itself, we know that muscle can, I don't want to say generate energy, but it is metabolically active tissue. And so that's where we're oxidizing fuels, et cetera, and in that process it generates heat. So in and of itself, that's important for the muscle, but it also has effects on overall metabolic rate. And that is linked certainly with a lot of diseases, and we'll talk about that. It is also the main site for storing amino acids. We know we can store fat very readily. Sometimes that's not an advantage across our body. We don't store a lot of protein to a great extent. And muscle serves as the largest pool for storing amino acids. And these are important not only because there's just a continual turnover. I think that's not well appreciated, that your cells, there's proteins in all cells throughout the body, and there's continual degradation and turnover. And how does that turnover? You need to have some building block to recreate those cells, to synthesize proteins that are responsible. We're just sitting here casually breathing, but we've got muscles working, our heart is pumping, our diaphragm is working to help us breathe, but also we've got movement of chemicals, ions throughout cells in the body, and all of that is affected by protein content. So it's very important to have this store of amino acids, and so it's something to consider that when you lose muscle mass with aging, you're affecting a number of these processes, and not just your ability to, now you can't run as fast as you used to be able to. I should also say that I am very happy, in fact I prefer if people have a conversation or questions to stop and don't wait till the very end. That I'm happy to deviate and stop at any time. You'll forgive me for wanting to show my data from my doctoral work, because certainly there have been more sophisticated studies that have come up with the same conclusions. But I kind of like this because it was such a crude measurement, and I get the same kind of values as some more sophisticated studies. So in this study, we looked at older adults, 55 to 86 years of age. They were healthy, independently living in the community. This work was conducted at the University of Western Ontario, so these are residents of London, Ontario. The women are represented by the open circles and the men by the closed circles. And this measure here, forearm cross-sectional area, was simply a girth. This is why I say it's a crude measure, the girth of the arm, to give us a reflection of the size of the muscle. Certainly there would be other factors. This doesn't take into consideration whether someone has more fat or not, so this is a very crude measurement. But even still, you could see that from the ages 55 of cross-sectional data to 86 years of age, individuals that are 86 years of age, there's this progressive reduction in what I'm using as an indicator of muscle mass. This is well done. Yes?
Is the muscle mass constant in composition over this period?
That's a great question. And certainly a measurement like this would not tell us that information, but it is not constant over that age period. And that also plays an important role in some of this metabolic changes that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to come back to some of those changes. And if I don't, then raise that question again. So that's an excellent question, and that gets to the quality of muscle that I really want to address, and not just the amount of muscle. So this is purely looking at the amount of muscle as it changes. So how much does it kind of change? Well, there are numbers depending on, the better studies would look at the same individual when they're 55, measure them again 10 years later, measure them again 10 years later, et cetera, to get an appreciation. This is cross-sectional data, and certainly it's easier to accumulate large numbers of individuals in these types of studies. So this work showed that there's a reduction of probably about 1.5% per year, 1% to 2% per year in changes in muscle mass with age. And this falls in line with other studies that have done expensive techniques of magnetic resonance imaging to better quantify the amount of muscle, or DEXA, which I also now use, dual X-ray absorptiometry, to use attenuation of X-rays to distinguish bone from fat tissue from lean tissue. but they all kind of come to the similar conclusion that you progressively lose muscle mass. Some studies will start this off as early as age 40. It's pretty much recognized that we can expect these kinds of changes at age 50. These data don't show really a difference in rate of loss with older age. Some studies will say that you have a second slope occurring after age 70 where the loss in muscle mass is accelerated. Not all studies support that. We also took a look in the same individuals at strength. And as you might expect, there's a relationship between strength and muscle. We recognize that. We understand that if you increase the size of your muscles with training, you're going to be stronger. Excuse me. So it's not surprising to find that you also have a reduction in strength in both men and women across the course of aging. What is particularly interesting is that if we normalize the strength changes for the amount of muscle, so what is the change in strength for a given amount of muscle, you still have this reduction. So even though we know muscle is important in terms of the amount of force it can generate, it's not the only thing that's happening. And that might speak to what you just addressed about, well, what about the amount of, what about the quality of muscle? We haven't really spoken about that. So people refer to this grip strength or force per amount of muscle as specific force. So specific force tends to be reduced. And at the time that I did this work, there was some investigations that showed something similar, but there were a lot of investigations that showed no. Once you account for the amount of muscle, there is no change in strength. So this is just starting to percolate, this idea that, oh, maybe there's something going on. Maybe not only do you lose muscle, but the muscle that's there isn't quite the same as it is when you're younger. And this was a particular interest to me. Excuse me. So this brings me to introduce the term sarcopenia. And this was a term that was coined by Professor Rosenberg in 1988, but it started to come about, started to percolate a little bit more in the early 90s. Because long before this, it was well known that you have that the change in muscle mass is one of the most obvious and common changes that occur in all individuals as they age. And so, because of this is so important, we better come up with a good word for it, and a good Greek word. So, sarco refers to flesh, and penia is the loss of this flesh with aging. And so there are various definitions. So initially, I know when I first learned this term, it was simply it's the loss of muscle that's related to aging. But now there's a bit more information on definition. And so now it's not just the fact that you've lost muscle, but how do you know, well, if you lose a little bit of muscle, or does that make you sarcopenic, a lot of muscle, and how do you quantify that? So it's a bit more common to express it in terms of the amount of muscle that an individual has relative to a younger individual. And these standards are usually individuals that are from 18 to 39, 18 to 40 years of age. So if you have a greater than 2 standard deviation reduction in muscle mass, then you're considered to be sarcopenic. Other investigators use that as well as some kind of functional measure. So not only do you have to have this lower muscle mass, but there has to be some implication for either strength or function. And these are measured in different ways. And this is a challenge that one of my grad students now, who's embarking on a training project that I'll talk about, is what functional measures do we use? There's a ton of them out there. But often it's leg strength, knee extensor strength, and a physical performance. One of the most common ones, because they want to match it with some of this leg strength, is speed of walking. And there are various tests, as short as 8 meters to the 400 meter to as far as you go in 6 minutes, etc. So a combination of these is often used to describe sarcopenia. And I should say that it's interesting, and there's a recent paper, a 2012 paper by Dr. Gigi Boy, who was a former professor here in nutritional sciences and a gastroenterologist, who has done just, you type, every time I think, oh, this would be a good idea, and I type in and I think, he's done that. He's done it. He's done everything. So just a wealth of knowledge. But he recently wrote a review describing the commonalities between sarcopenia, this loss of muscle mass with age, and cachexia. I don't know if people are familiar with the term cachexia, which is also a loss of muscle mass, but often now we talk about cachexic individuals, like those individuals that have some kind of a chronic disease. So it's the phenotype might be the same, that you've got lower muscle mass and reduced function, but the consequences, the etiology is quite different, that there might be higher levels of inflammation that are precipitating this, or some tumors that are increasing metabolism. So sarcopenia, cachexia, and also anorexia, that there's some commonalities, and that is also interesting. And in fact, some of my research, I have one line of investigation looking at aging, and another looking at anorexia and food restriction and its implications for muscle health, because we can pull information on mechanisms for these muscle loss from both of these.
So, when is atrophy used instead or in place of sarcopenia? Because I often hear it sort of
Yes.
synonymously, and I know they're not really, but...
Well, it is kind of similar. Atrophy is also a loss of muscle, and a reduction in muscle size. It's often used in terms of if there is an injury, something that can be corrected fairly rapidly. So used to describe sort of an acute change, and whether it's bed rest, there's some atrophy, and then a couple of days someone's exercising on a bike and you've got hypertrophy, so muscle growth. So atrophy is really the process. It is certainly a component of this, but I guess it's associated with a bit of less information because it can be in any condition.
Right.
So this 8-year-old that breaks their arm and is in a cast, their muscle is going to atrophy because of immobilization, but not necessarily associated with some of these other factors. Question. Yes.
You mentioned speed of walking. Is it a cause or a result of these changes, or is it both? Or is it something else?
That's a very good question, and I'm sitting on a paper about the speed of walking that's actually from some of these data. And a former mentor of mine, and my postdoc also was involved in a paper that just came out looking at speed of walking and its relationship to mitochondrial function. We'll talk about mitochondria. Mitochondria are organelles, which our students learn as being the powerhouses of all cells, because these are organelles in all tissues, but in muscle we focus on, that are responsible for converting the food energy that we eat into chemical energy that's used by all cells, used for muscle contraction, but used for, as I said, pumping ions back and forth, electrical activity of the heart, et cetera, et cetera. And so to get at your question, that there's now been links with mitochondrial function and walking ability, that you have this reduced aerobic capacity of muscle, and that impacts the speed of walking. I don't have the data to show you here, but in the same subjects that I've just shown you, the men and women 55 to 86 years of age, we looked at different speeds of walking. Self-paced, it was all self-paced walking. So what is your comfortable pace of walking? How does that change across the ages? What is your fast walking? What is your as fast as possible? And what factors are responsible for predicting these different speeds? And certainly strength, leg strength was one important factor. Excuse me, but it accounted for, if I remember correctly, 30% roughly of the variance in the data. So there were other important factors. The amount of muscle was also, so strength was actually, and muscle were separate predictors. And that also told me that, okay, the amount of muscle is important, but strength maybe gives us something about the quality of muscle. There's something else there. And so that might feed in with now this idea of mitochondria being important in predicting this. But there's certainly other factors that some of you here would be more aware than I am, and another, we looked at this with a scale looking at anxiety, depression, and all of these things can also affect. I would assume that they would have a greater effect at the lower speeds, the choice of walking at a comfortable pace, and maybe the upper limits are dictated maybe a bit more by some physiological processes. That would be my sense, but that's still open for debate. Thank you. So,
I have one question.
Yes.
Is there any way you can delay the process of
delay the process of changes in muscle, or,
Yeah.
or delay the process of aging? You know, I had yes. And yes, I think you can, and that will be the good news story that I'm going to try to reiterate as we go through. That you can make significant changes, and you can make those changes at any age and see considerable impact. That there's ability for muscle to adapt to exercise at any age. The adaptation, and this is what I find interesting because I think it helps us understand what exactly is happening, that the adaptation is, I think we're coming to realize, is different sometimes in older muscle than it is in younger muscle, but there's still that ability to adapt. And maybe the reasons why there's these different adaptations gives us some clues as to what's causing this loss in muscle mass in the first place. So my choice of pictures, when I said what is aging, I had that one slide of a gentleman that they'd artistically drawn to age over time. But as I was looking for those kinds of figures, there were some, and lots of the ones with women in those had the caption, "The Curse of Aging." Well, I said, I don't want to put that. It's not the curse of aging. That's not what we're trying to get. In a different life, before I joined the faculty here, I was at the University of Washington, and I was part of a group, the Genetics of Aging and Training group there from NIH training grant. And so a lot of people were not doing any kind of human work, and really the goal of some of that research was taking a look at things that change the lifespan, and that also gives us clue, even though that's not the focus of human research. We're not trying to make people live to 150. I don't think we can do that. But the goal is to extend the health span, it's referred to. So that, wouldn't it be wonderful if we were all healthy until we're 85, 95, 100, and then we just die peacefully in our sleep. We don't suffer any diseases. Our quality of life is maintained at a high level for all this period of time. And so that's what's sort of speaking to the type of intervention that we're doing, and we're being from the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education, we're all interested in the impact of exercise in mitigating some of these changes that are associated with aging. And that, perfect timing for the question, because that is the million-dollar question. When we see any kind of age-associated changes, it increases in, there's age-associated diseases, neurodegenerative diseases, metabolic diseases. How much of that is a result of aging? How much of it is a result of other factors that happen to coincide that are contemporaneous with aging, such as changes in physical activity? We know that there's a reduction in physical activity with age. What role does that play in some of these changes? It opens the door for potential intervention that could help attenuate or reverse some of these changes. And there's a couple of slides, and this is one slide that I show, and I somehow managed to squeeze it into lots of different talks that I give. So this individual, at the time of this photo, is 68 years of age. Looks in pretty good shape. I don't think any of us would mind looking like that when we're 68 years of age. Clearly someone who has done resistance training for a period of time. This is the same individual 10 years later, still an avid exerciser, still maintaining resistance training, but you could see that there's a difference in that 10 years, and a difference, and I don't mean more gray hairs, but there's a difference in the muscle tone, or the amount of muscle that there appears to be on this individual, despite the fact that they've continued training. And I have information that they maintained their sort of training regimen in terms of frequency of training, etc. Don't know about necessarily the volume. That often, obviously, the intensity of training also usually goes down with aging. But this sort of points to the fact that, again, wouldn't mind looking like this when I'm 78 years of age. So this is, but it does tell us, even with activity, there is some aging component, and I think we all intuitively recognize that. But it's nice to know what effect can aging, what effect can exercise have in attenuating some of these changes. So regardless, that's one story. Regardless of what you do, we're not attempting to completely cancel out the fact that we age. We don't have a magic solution for that. But exercise can certainly go a long way. Okay, so what? A favorite question of my doctoral mentor. Every time I thought I had this great idea that come with all these plans. So what? You have to explain why is this relevant? Well, okay, I think we've made the case that potentially you lose some muscle that can affect mobility, it can affect balance, reduce speed of walking, all of these things, and things that are not up here affecting confidence, that also has implications for how frequently if someone's going to be active and the choices that they make. Simple tasks, simple activities of daily living, ADLs they're called. The ability to get up from a chair, carry groceries back from the store, etc. There's certainly sarcopenia is linked with an increased prevalence of hospitalization, And this is touted, a very frequently cited paper, gives us stats, United States stats, that this results in something like $18.5 billion costs in terms of healthcare with sarcopenic associated conditions a year. So what can we do to sort of make an economic impact as well? Well, still, so what? Those are stats. How does that rely? Well, all of these things, hopefully you're able to sort of grasp that these things are very likely to impact the quality of life of individuals as they age. The choices. People would like to maintain and do the things that they've always enjoyed doing. And so what can we do to help support continued participation in some of these activities? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about aerobic capacity. And to do that, I thought I have to just give a little bit of background about how we measure it and exactly what does that mean. And this, you may or may not have heard the term aerobic capacity. We think of it, a lot of the prescription, it's recently been changed in terms of Health Canada, the guidelines for physical activity and aging. But you've probably heard there's a lot of emphasis in years gone by on cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory training. People may be more familiar with that term, or aerobic type of exercises, or doing aerobics. And this really is training a particular system. But I mention it here even though I'm talking about muscle, because muscle is an important factor in determining aerobic capacity. So these two things can't really be separated, even though the term kind of thing, well, that's just talking about how well your heart and lungs are working. The muscle is a driver of those things, and so these things are intricately linked. Excuse me. I think I have to use a lozenge, so I'm sorry, that's going to sound not great. So in the lab, many people maybe have heard of a stress test, a physician's test, or in a lab such as those in our faculty. We measure oxygen uptake. It can be on a bike, on a treadmill, and individuals breathe into almost like a scuba mask mouthpiece. And we collect gas samples that allow us to determine the oxygen and the amount of air that's being inspired and expired, and the amount of carbon dioxide. And from that, we can have an idea of the oxygen that's being utilized by the tissues. Certainly, we're sitting here at rest. I've mentioned that we have a resting metabolic rate. So we're taking in oxygen, it's being utilized by cells, and we're getting a resting metabolic rate. When you start to exercise, that increases the demand. Okay, now your muscles are working, they need some more energy. So your heart pumps a little faster, a greater volume of blood. Your ventilation, you start to breathe a little bit more to increase the flow of oxygen to working tissues. And this is translated into an increase in uptake of oxygen by those tissues. And so that's what this red line is just showing, that the harder you work, the more oxygen is taken up by the tissues. It needs to do that to support the work that you're doing. And that flat line or plateau at the top, at some point when you're doing this exercise incremental ramp, you get to a point where actually you can't take up any more oxygen. You sort of plateau in a conch out, and that's your oxygen up, your maximal oxygen uptake, or your VO2 max. And that defines your maximal aerobic capacity, and that's what I'm going to talk to you in the next slide. So the figure that I just showed you, you might be thinking, okay, that's good for the varsity athletes to find out what their maximal aerobic capacity is. I never need to know that. And you might not actually need to know what that actual number is, but having a fairly high maximal aerobic capacity is important to all of us, because any kind of task that we perform requires some amount, some derivative of that maximal capacity. So if you've got a very low maximal capacity, then you're going to be working really hard just to walk out of this room if you've got a really limited aerobic capacity. So while the number might be less important to us than it is to elite athletes, having that range, having that buffer is very important. And I hope to convince you in the next couple of slides of why that is. So here's that same variable, oxygen uptake, on the y-axis. And here we've got different ages across the x-axis. And it's showing a few different kinds of tasks. So in a 20-year-old, first of all, it's showing that you might have a maximal, this would be someone who's not necessarily trained, but a maximal aerobic capacity, this is just the units, kilogram liters per minute, mils per kilogram per minute, of 40. And in an older individual who's 80, That's now far less. It might be 25, 26. So it's just showing the natural reduction in aerobic capacity that occurs with age. And all the stuff in between is showing what impact that might have for various activities of daily living. So there's a cost associated with everything. We could put that same instrumentation on people and ask them to cook dinner and find out what is the oxygen cost of you actually standing up and doing things in the kitchen. So there's a cost associated with any kind of activity that we do, and this is just giving a schematic of what some of those costs might be. So the cost of dressing might be somewhere down here, around 10 mils per kilogram. And so for this young person who's 20, it's a fraction, it's a quarter of their mass capacity. That's hardly, it's effortless for this individual. Someone who's 80, they're about 50%. They're working at about 50% of their maximum capacity. Other, maybe more intense types of activities, walking on the level, walking on a staircase. Again, these are general things. You know, people get upset. Does that mean you can't walk at a certain age? It depends with the vigor with which you are exercising. Certainly you could walk at a slower pace. But this is meant to illustrate that there's some more intense activities that when you're younger you sort of take for granted that you can run up the hill or do something because you're still well below what your maximum capacity is. But the cost of doing that work is still the same when you're older. And if you've reduced your capacity, then you might be approaching, it doesn't have to be over, you could be even approaching, makes that exercise difficult and makes someone not want to do it. Why would you do something that's going to leave you short of breath and that's uncomfortable and it's scary for some individuals? And that itself is a deterrent from physical activity and from exercise.
So I just want to add too, and probably where that research out of McMaster, they were looking at extended bed rests for people, and a lot of times people think, well, as long as they can do these activities, but after 2 or 3 days in bed is all it took in the hospital for people to no longer be able to do these things because they were so close to their end of their reserve that an 18-year-old with 3 days of bed rest was still compromised, but they are working at such a low level of their reserve that it's not even noticeable. An 80-year-old, they can't get out of bed because they were already so close to 100% that just 3 days in bed took them over the line, so to speak.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
A bout of pneumonia could be enough for lose your independence,
Yeah.
right?
And I'll show you the next slide, and then I'll have to just convince people that we didn't actually talk before we came. This is the first time we've met. But yes, no, you're absolutely right. And so this line represents a threshold of aerobic capacity. This is a proposed, this is a theoretical threshold that would allow an individual to live independently. So that if you do not have this minimum amount of aerobic capacity, aerobic reserve, then now you need some help in terms of living. And this, of course, and most of you know better than I, has major implications for quality of life. And this is where I have to say we didn't know each other ahead of time. So you're exactly right. And some of this did come from a group at McMaster and others in the UK, looking at the effect of bed rest on muscle mass, but also on aerobic capacity, because again, that muscle mass sort of sets the demand for oxygen when we're exercising. So that absolutely a young individual, there's no numbers here, this is a schematic, might start with a certain amount of muscle mass, and they too, if they're in bed for hospitalization, injury, illness, will lose some muscle mass. If we compare that with an older individual, not only is an older individual starting at a lower muscle mass, but actually the rate of loss has been demonstrated to be greater in aging. And some of the numbers are illustrated there. And so this has real implications that we don't sort of think about. And you couple that with the fact that often it takes older individuals longer to recover from things like the flu, things that might be somewhat inconsequential to a younger individual, all of a sudden might pose have serious ramifications for an older individual with already a lower amount of muscle mass and a lower aerobic capacity. Excuse me. So this really helps to illustrate, when we're talking about sarcopenia, again, it's just an ongoing theme, is to be interested not only in the fact that there's a reduction in the amount of muscle, the quantity of muscle, but that there's also a reduction in the quality of muscle. And both of these, they do work synergistically, but one is not exclusive of the other. It's not all about the amount of muscle. The remaining muscle seems to behave differently. And both of these, of course, have consequences for function. So, what's the link now? Maybe now we can have a more open conversation about changes in muscle quality between muscle and chronic disease. Well, obesity is being considered a chronic disease. And we won't get into the fact that there's certainly a debate as to whether there's an obesity epidemic or whether we should be using that term or not. But certainly there's an increasing rates, increasing prevalence of obesity now. And that muscle mass can also play a role here, even in terms of obesity. So that there's wide reports of increasing obesity in children as well. But if we think about changes in body fat with aging, these are often commensurate with changes. I mean, I've already said that you're going to be losing muscle tissue. And so what role just not having that muscle play in facilitating this onset of obesity? Excuse me. So I mentioned that muscle is metabolically active, and you've got a continual turnover in terms of proteins. And so if you lose that amount of muscle, you've got less of that activity. So that activity, this protein renewal, this cell turnover, requires energy. It's part and parcel of your resting metabolism, of your metabolic rate, how much energy you expend in a given day. If you've got less muscle, that impacts your energy expenditure for that day. And these numbers vary, but Wolf et al. 2006 proposed that for each 10 kilogram of muscle that you lose, that changes your resting energy expenditure by about 100 calories per day, which isn't very much per day. But if you sort of think that this obesity doesn't happen overnight, but it happens over time, or overweight over time, it's been linked with other kind of chronic conditions, that this is just an ongoing thing. It adds up over a period of time. That can help contribute to a lower energy expenditure from the same caloric intake, adds to weight gain and fat gain. It's also, a number of studies are looking at the association between changes in muscle mass with aging and how this is associated with changes in insulin resistance that can also progress to diabetes. And there are a couple of different theories, and this maybe gets to the question of what the question was, is the quality, and maybe that might have been a structural question, is the quality of muscle, does it look the same with aging? Well, there's been more and more investigation, not only in changes in body composition, but changes in muscle composition with aging. And so while there's increase in some cases, not all cases, in some individuals they don't increase body fat with aging, but they lose muscle mass. And maybe they're more predisposed to being the frail elderly. But you can also have a loss of muscle mass and be overweight. And there's a lot of research being done on sarcopenic obesity. But there are also changes within the muscle, and that there are greater amounts of fat being deposited within muscle. And this has implications for muscle metabolism, or its muscle's ability to oxidize different fuels. And so I think early on there was sort of a theory that maybe just this general increase in weight, you have this increase in, we break down the fats that we eat into smaller components, and these fatty acids circulate and they might impair muscle's metabolism, muscle's ability to oxidize glucose. And that would mean that now you're not as efficient as taking glucose out of the blood, and that poses a bit of insulin resistance. You dump a bit more insulin out so that to help, and you become this insulin resistance. And it was theorized that this was largely because if you have this increase in circulating free fatty acids. But now there's been a lot of investigation showing, that's not always the case. In some cases, you still have this insulin resistance. You don't have this increase in free fatty acids. And people are looking more and more closely at the muscle itself and its role, the role that it plays in affecting its own metabolism. And this is where there's been a very strong association between these deposits of fat in the muscle affecting metabolism. And this is easily, people that have looked at nice magnetic resonance imaging, I'm not sure if you've seen pictures in magazines and newspapers where it looks like a slab of steak, and it's a cross-section of someone's muscle, and just like a steak where you've got some marbling, some fat within the muscle, there's an increase in prevalence of that occurring with aging, and it has implications for metabolism as well as just the amount of muscle is reduced. I'm listing a few, but it could go on. This could just to get the idea that muscle has implications far outreaching just movement. Osteoporosis is also a strong link. What's good for muscle is good for bone. What's good for bone is good for muscle. Things that result in muscle loss also result in bone loss. So aside from the fact that as you lose muscle mass, some individuals will lose weight with age, some individuals maintain their weight, but the composition changes. But weight bearing is certainly an important factor for bone health. But outside of that weight bearing, the amount of mechanical force, mechanical load from a muscle, a voluntary load on muscle, also is a predictor of bone health. And so that can also play a role, again, if you are reducing muscle mass with age, it can also have consequences for osteoporosis. Similarly, exercise or training that might enhance the amount of muscle could likely also benefit bone health. So I won't go into great detail, but I throw this up. The center of the universe, the mighty mitochondria, and this is that organelle that I was talking about that's in muscle. And it has a sort of a unique structure that all cells have membranes. This also has an inner membrane, and it's on this inner membrane that there are several proteins that are responsible for oxidizing, converting the fuels that we eat, oxidizing them, and converting that into some chemical energy that can be used for contraction or used for maintaining equilibrium of concentration of different metabolites inside and outside of cells. So this is important. It's important in muscle metabolism, but it's important in neural metabolism, etc. And so I throw this out as the center of the universe because changes in mitochondrial function, or the term mitochondrial dysfunction, this is, you could do a PubMed search on this hit and you get tens of thousands of hits on this mitochondrial dysfunction and aging and what's the role and what are the causes. Because this is linked with neurodegenerative diseases, with metabolic diseases, so things we just talked about, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, everything you can imagine. But I'm throwing this up here because changes in mitochondria are also possible with exercise. So this exercise, I'm trying to sell you on the fact that exercise can be a good thing, not only in changing the amount of muscle, but it can change, it can result in cellular adaptations that can be beneficial in terms of metabolism in older individuals. Here are some data. I'm paying homage to my mentor at the University of Washington, who took a look. I thought this was going to come up one at a time, so sorry. Let's just look at this first panel here. That's looking at individuals, two groups, separate groups of individuals, a group with a mean age of 38 and a group of 68. And this was kind of a running joke in the lab because we think we had to always call these adults because these were really us in the lab. So a lot of studies will look at younger adults, but we don't have any, we're running out, we don't have any students to bring this number down, so we'll just keep increasing this. It's more middle-aged approaching, and older adults. And looking at phosphorylation capacity, which is a big word, but it's like aerobic capacity, the ability to generate that chemical energy, ATP, that we were talking about, and seeing how this changes. So taking a look at muscle biopsies and measuring this biochemically. And taking a look at and using magnetic resonance spectroscopy to determine what are the rates of this generation or conversion of energy in muscle. And show that, yes, in older individuals, this is at rest, and looking at their max to convert it into their maximal capacity, that there's a reduction in this capacity to synthesize this ATP. And maximal capacity synthesizes ATP. Okay, that's not completely surprising. We know that you lose the amount of muscle, so it's the same old story. We're tired of hearing about that downward slope. Okay, it's reduced with aging. And when we took a look at the amount of muscle, and so the number of mitochondria, mitochondrial content, well, that certainly could explain it. There's a reduction in the amount of muscle, the amount of mitochondria with aging. So, of course, there's going to be a reduction in the amount of ATP that can be synthesized. But then they normalized the amount of ATP synthesis, the phosphorylation capacity per volume of mitochondria, and still there was a reduction. So again, that speaks to the question of, well, what is changing? Maybe this is something that you can't visually see, that marbling, that increase in fat deposition, we can see that in an image. But what can we see? There's some other qualitative changes in muscle that are happening here. And I'm happy to discuss the line of investigation, but this is the part that I thought I'm going to cut that off, but people are going to have a snooze in terms of what might be going on in terms of mitochondrial coupling or mitochondrial function here. So this might represent quantitative changes that we've discussed, but there's also importantly qualitative changes that occur with muscle. The good news is, and this is a favorite study that's highly cited, but I love to always show these data because these subjects reached into their 90s that underwent this resistance training by Friaderoni in 1994. So it's an older study, but highly referenced because of this wonderful range of individuals, ages that were in the study. And these individuals were recruited from retirement homes to participate in a 10-week resistance training study because it was recognized that, hey, the amount of muscle is important and maybe we need to do something to help train these individuals that can solve a lot of problems in terms of mobility and strength, which has been linked with mortality and morbidity and mortality. So in this study, on the y-axis here is just the change in muscle strength that occurred over the 10-week course of the study. And there was a group that had exercise. They also thought nutrition was an important, I haven't talked about nutrition, but nutrition plays an important role in these individuals. Maybe we give them a supplement. And this supplement was sort of fell in line with the recommended dietary allowance, a macronutrient distribution range of roughly 60% carbohydrates and a little over 20% fat and a little 15% or so protein. And so they got supplement. There was a group that only got the supplement, no exercise, and a control that didn't receive anything. And so the wonderful news is that look at these possible changes in strength, even in a group of individuals that were in their 80s, 90s years of age. Their muscles adapted well, and this was a standard training program that we would recommend where you've got you figure out a person's 1 repetition maximum, or there's a progressive load that you're always stimulating, that someone's lifting a certain load, and when they can lift that with greater ease, then you increase the load a little bit to stimulate. So it was that kind of progressive training over the course of the 10 weeks that resulted in these remarkable changes. The effect of the supplement alone, because there's consideration, especially the incidence of malnutrition, has been suggested to be greater in individuals, in older individuals, and in individuals that are not living independently. And the effect of the supplement didn't change, but they also took note that individuals who received the supplement actually then their habitual caloric intake was also reduced. So it wasn't that they didn't get any more calories, but it had the effect of reducing voluntary caloric intake. And so there was no change in strength for those individuals. So this is great news. Interestingly, these are data from the same study, that this increased exercise, whether they were in the supplement group or no supplement group, but that resulted in they were wearing monitors to determine their habitual level, voluntary level of physical activity throughout the day. And those individuals that participated in the exercise program actually moved around more voluntarily on their own throughout the day. And so that again supports this idea of, maybe there's other factors besides strength. You don't require a certain amount of strength perhaps for some of the activities they were performing. Did they feel more confident? Did they have better balance, etc.? There are a number of factors that weren't measured that might play a role in the benefits of this type of exercise training in older age. So one of my grad students, Dina Katsoulis, is about to embark on recruiting for a resistance type training study. And she's interested in taking a look at the effects of strength and power training on, now again, I told you that for no reason whatsoever I have interest in looking at a middle-aged population in addition to an older age population. And so she's embarking on this training protocol looking at these, both forms of resistance training, one with a focus on a rapid movement that would affect power. And the idea is that she has interest in looking at, this is another question in the literature, of is one form of training better? Does it really matter? We're trying to figure out training that people will adopt. It's great that we can have these training protocols in the lab, but if nobody's actually capable of doing it, it just doesn't work in a community setting, then that's also a problem. So she'll have a couple of groups of subjects, middle-aged and older, and both males and females. when we looked at this study. And another reason for us looking at this, there's a host of measurements that we'll be making. But I mentioned that while it's great that great news and well recognized that muscle can adapt to training at any age, that some of these adaptations, some of the nuances are also interesting. There have been some studies, and I'm thinking of a study by Sharon Jubrius and colleagues in 2001. The title of that paper was Large Energetic Adaptations to Resistance Training in Older Muscle. So normally we think of, we teach this to our undergraduate students, if you want to increase your maximal aerobic capacity, you should do endurance type of exercise activities, and you achieve that change in aerobic capacity because your heart pumps with a bit more vigor. Your heart rate, your maximal heart rate doesn't really change that much, but your contraction, heart contraction increases, so your cardiac output increases. But also you have these lovely adaptations within muscle. You've got all kinds of enzymes, proteins that help facilitate that conversion of energy into ATP. And all of these, lots of proteins, lots of enzymes, all of these adaptations occur in the muscle that help facilitate increased aerobic metabolism. And this naturally occurs with aerobic training. If you ask get younger individuals to perform resistance training, you don't see those same aerobic changes. You see resistance type changes, increases in strength, often increases in muscle mass, etc. But interestingly, in this study with older individuals, they performed resistance training, and they did get increases in strength, as you would expect, but they had dramatic changes in aerobic capacity as well, and you don't necessarily see that in younger individuals. So it's another bonus, it's another benefit of resistance type training in older muscle, but it also again points to the fact that the quality of muscle is different with aging, and that's part of the reason why this adaptation is different. But it could be, to me, that says it's even more beneficial in older age to consider muscle health as a primary goal in terms of exercise training. So that's good information. Now what? Putting theory into practice. And I'm gonna whip through these couple of slides. I'm showing this here. It's a colleague at Western, but I'm showing it because this program is hopefully soon to come in the next year or so here
Toronto?
to U of T.
Oh, good. I've been trying to get this here. So
Oh,
good.
yeah.
To Toronto.
So this Get Fit for Active Living exercise program. So this was originally conducted at, this is in case you didn't know what GFAL stood for. We'll have to go through this. So this is an 8-week intervention program that not only were there some trained supervision initially of different types of exercise, but there's an educational component, sort of an explanation that helps give individuals sort of the rationale behind the type of exercise and the type of exercising that they're doing. So there's some experiential learning, that they have a little bit of lecture theory component and then a practical component. It consists of 3 exercise sessions per week with a focus on all of these things. We've been talking about muscle and strength training, but they include cardiovascular, flexibility, balance type of exercises. And I should say that this was originated at the Centre for Activity and Aging, or it's the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging at the University of Western Ontario. And I'll show you a slide in a second that they enlisted a few different sites to really pilot test some of this work. And the educational session, as I said, went over some of the rationale behind some of this program. So they had interest in determining functional changes in fitness over this course of this 8-week program, and what also might happen 6 months down the road, a year down the road, in terms of people maintaining their level of physical activity even after the formal program ended. So these sites were affiliated with universities, but they were implemented at different areas also within the community. This is just a timeline of the study. Baseline measures were taken just so that you could compare what was the effect of the training after 8 weeks. They followed up at 6 months, so now the program had stopped, but they followed up with the people to see, are they continuing to exercise, what kind of exercise are they doing, to get an idea of the volume of exercise, and then another phone call at 12 months later. So some of the functional changes, this SPBB is the short performance battery score. And there are a number of functional tests that are scored, that are sort of put into this one overall score. Things like standing up from a chair, excuse me, tucked up and go, walking a certain distance. And these data show that after the 8 weeks, luckily I'm almost done, a couple more slides, that there was a significant improvement in this functional measure of performance after this 8-week program. So too was there an increase in the 400-meter walk, so that they were able to walk that distance in a lesser amount of time. The timed up and go, again, standing up out of a chair, walking a particular distance, they were able to do that in less amount of time. Repeated chair stands, taking a look a little bit at sort of muscular endurance. So all of these parameters improved, significant improvements. Arm curls, chair flexibility measure, chair sit and reach over the course. So this was really encouraging, which is why now another grant has gone in to include other sites, and we're one of those sites. And we will also take on, we'll have a bit more of the biology measurements to take a look at, you know, what is it that caused some of these changes. So there'll be a little bit of a laboratory component in what's being introduced here at U of T. So we are very excited about this because not only are they're beneficial results here that I'm showing you, but what I didn't show you is the follow-up at the 6 months and at the 1 year, that there was pretty good adherence. 64% achieved the same amount of exercise that was recommended, and even higher numbers were doing something. They're not quite this level that was suggested by the training program. So that's beneficial. And this has, you know, and I think that's great. Even the data that I showed you at the beginning, all the men and women, there were a couple hundred individuals. I mean, long after that study finished, and I didn't keep track of what volume of exercise they were doing, but those groups still met on a regular basis. They formed friends, and it became a social thing that they continued to meet at the same place where they had their walking, etc. So this is the kind of thing, these kind of lifestyle changes, and so something like this, we're pretty excited about implementing here. So I'll just finish a summary, but I'm happy to take questions. As I said, I sort of fluffed over some of the mechanistic work that we're also interested in, but I'm happy to take questions on those. So we talked about, and hopefully there's no debate over the fact that you have this loss of muscle mass with advancing age, but importantly, you also have reductions in muscle quality. And this impacts not only the strength kind of measures and mobility issues, but also is linked with numerous types of chronic diseases, age-associated diseases. And lastly, you got to end on a good note that exercise is an effective intervention at combating. So you mentioned attenuating some of these things. So while you still might have an individual who, you know, think of that individual that I showed you, the 10-year difference. If that individual catches a flu and is in bed for a few days, you know, I've no doubt that they'll still be able to function. Whereas a lot of individuals that are older, there's studies looking at what happens to the rates of independence after hip fracture risk in older individuals. And I think I recently read some astronomical number, 50% of individuals over a certain age, and it's usually in women, they start off with a lower muscle mass, don't walk again after such a fracture. Because the fracture itself, compounded with the bed rest and the time, they've just lost so much muscle mass and aerobic capacity without some kind of intervention that really puts them at a huge disadvantage. So this really has implications for increasing that reserve, but also immediately changing sort of some metabolic functions that can be beneficial in terms of their association with disease. I'll end here, and I would be very happy to take questions, take more questions. Yes?
You mentioned about as far as getting into the exercise habit or the development of habituation with exercise. Now, as strange as it may seem, a physiotherapist once suggested that I could be a motor moron. By that, I think she meant the incapacity to remember the frequency, duration, reps, and so on of certain exercises. Is that a passing thing, or is it a condition? that could be described as that? An inability to sustain a pattern of exercise.
I'm not sure that I completely understand. So is that to say that if someone asked you to, if the physiotherapist said, gave you an exercise, a knee extension, and said you need to lift this amount 5 times, that...
The details like that.
Are you asking if those details are important, or if there was a reason why you weren't able to achieve that prescription?
I guess I'm wondering if that is a known or regular condition among people who need to do exercise, or if it's something that can be overcome by getting into the exercise habit.
You're supposed to do 30 actions, and you get up to number 25 and you forget where you're at. Is that what you mean?
Not quite, but that could be component.
That's what I experienced.
Okay. You know, I'm going to do a terrible job at answering because I'm still not quite sure, I have not.
I think I know where he's coming from.
I'm not familiar with what you're describing, and so could you?
Well, if it's, I'm a trainer, so that's why it's kind of dear to my heart, and I work almost exclusively with older adults, and one of the things that they tell me is that if they have gone to a therapist for exercises, they always find that they don't get the level of detail that I give them, and it's not because the physiotherapist doesn't know, it's just that they're busy, it's in a clinical setting, they're usually giving them a set of exercises and they tell them to do X, Y, and Z, usually with a few stick men that are drawn.
Yep.
And what I do is I give people pictures, like the actual picture, me doing the exercise before and after, not before or after, but both, and tell them exactly how many repetitions, and then we go through a process of how to increase that and how to increase the weight. And it's just a matter of, I'm taking what the trainer or what the therapist does more on a sort of a clinical, here you go, we only have 10 minutes, to I have an hour with you and I see you multiple times. And so I think you're not a moron, it's just a matter of, to use your language, it's just a matter of they haven't spent the time to translate this to lifestyle. It's more of a, it's therapy, but it's not seen as what am I going to do for the rest of my days, right? So give yourself a break. It's just you probably haven't been given maybe enough specific and give it to you in a form that makes sense from an habitual lifestyle setting.
So you have found a way to deal with the deficits resulting from the instructions from the physiotherapist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just a matter of writing it out and making it very clear, having pictures, giving people a training log, and that's just generally what it is. It's just follow these steps, and people have busy lives, and I think sometimes physios sort of forget that people are going to go on and do other things after they leave the office, so they just need something very specific.
Great, thank you.
And thank you for that discussion, because I was on a different tangent. I was trying to think of some physiological.
No, I hear this all the time.
Okay.
So I think it's
and I'll just add to that, absolutely, that I mean, this instruction, this program was highly successful, and there was specific training, a standardized training across all the sites, and one individual training every single person that was involved in the same thing will happen here. But on that note, and this is, I'm glad that you're mentioning this, and a reason to have people who have some background in training is important. That these, even let's not even talk about this GFAL program. There's a range of different kinds of exercises that you could do to achieve the same goal. Whether it's, if you want to improve your tricep muscle, sure, you could get down and do push-ups, but maybe someone can't do that or they can't remember, so maybe you do something leaning against a wall. Maybe someone's very comfortable and they've done resistance training, the gentleman in the photo, and you give them an exercise with dumbbells, as that gentleman had in his hand. And other people think, I need to write something down. Please let me sit in a machine that you tell me my seat height needs to be at 8, and I write it down, and there's only one option to how that machine moves. So even if I tried to do something, it couldn't possibly move that way. So there's a wonderful variety, and other facilities don't have such equipment, such machines. And so there's bands or lifting cans of soup. There are so many different ways, and so it's unfortunate, and I'm sorry to hear that you didn't have that experience where you were exposed to this variety of things that I have no doubt that there's something that could work for everyone. And it sounds like you're doing an excellent job of setting that message. Because that's the opposite, that's the last thing we want, and that's a major concern and situation of children in school that get to a certain age and think, I hate gym, I hate phys ed, and so you think, what experience did they have that led to that sets them up for later years? Yes.
Yesterday I heard Jeff Fernie speak, and he very clearly said definitely there is a loss of muscle tone and quality and quantity of muscle as we age, but the importance of exercise. Last night, I'm an elder care consultant, so last night I saw a lady who was 79. And I met her daughter a year ago, and her daughter said, I just want to know where we can put my mother, and she didn't want me to see the mother. Well, my colleague got her this year. My colleague said, I'm not dealing with it unless I see mother, so she came into the office last night, and the two of us met with her. And she had been in a retirement home for 11 months. Now, this lady has really bad knees, and she was having trouble walking. But the daughter said that the 11 months in this facility made a big difference because she went to exercise programs 3 times a week, and she actually improved her ability to walk. She moved back home with the daughter. She's been home with the daughter for 2 months, and it's deteriorated because the daughter has stairs. She has trouble going up and down the stairs. She's not doing her exercises. So what you told us today, this puts it in perspective quite nicely. The second question is, because of what I do, when are they going to be doing the studies here in Toronto? I'm just very curious.
Well, the training study that my graduate students doing is January, February will be starting.
Can I sign up?
Introduction to the and here's the issue. You're more than welcome. We will send broadly out recruitment, but you could be in the exercise group or you could be in the control group. But it just means that for a period of time that you might not be in that exercise group, but we of course will offer that same program after the conclusion of the study. And the GFAL program, we're working on the details. I'm hoping that it is 2013.
I mean, falls are a real issue with seniors.
Yes.
And if they fall a lot and families say, well, I want them to do in long-term care, and the reality is they fall more in long-term care than they do at home.
Well, a lot of it comes down to if they're not trained in long-term
Oh, I
care,
agree.
they often aren't. I mean, one of the
For
biggest,
sure.
yeah, one of the biggest things with falls is that people lose their ability to extend their center of gravity over some
It's a balance
support.
issue,
So
yeah.
it's a balance issue, and there was a study done not long ago in BC where they looked at long-term care facilities and they used the security cameras. They weren't spying on anybody.
Yeah,
They just
right.
noticed when people fell, it was primarily from just loss of balance, just getting up from standing or getting up from sitting, just transferring. And unfortunately, it's one of these situations in long-term care that usually the staff are so busy that nobody's really getting exercise. And if they are, it's more more fun than fitness.
Right.
Anytime, like I've taught in classes in retirement homes before, and the first thing people say to me is like, "Wow, you work us so hard. Nobody's ever done this." And I go, "Is it too hard?" No, we need this. The other instructor was too Mickey Mouse, and I'm just using quotes.
No,
but
you're
it's
right. You're
because
quite correct.
people feel like, oh, don't move anything. It's like, well, they have to move something.
If you don't
and
move,
if you
you have
train
problems.
and if you can give them specific training that's going to improve their abilities, instead of just babysit them in a class, then they will have improvements, but it has to be consistent.
You know Jeff Fernie? You must know him.
I don't know him personally, but I know who he
He's
is.
head of the Toronto Rehab
Yes.
Institute. And I mean, the two of you should be talking together because he's doing so many studies on balance and issues like this with all age groups.
Exercise we mentioned, but the quality of the exercises that you use matter. Like, because I do hydrotherapy, I've taught several weeks, and hydrotherapy is the only thing I can do because my physiotherapists won't take me. I've got balance issues, I've got issues with me. So would that actually make a difference at all in affecting the change of muscle mass?
It sure could make a difference in terms of any type of even given the same exercise and having a different intensity, volume, etc. could also make a difference. And so this is kind of where I in some ways struggle, both with a discussion on resistance training as well as a discussion on aerobic training, because while I'm certain that what I've just said is accurate, that the same is true for aerobic exercise, that it depends what the goal is. If the goal is to achieve an increase in muscle mass, then maybe that's a bit more challenging with certain types of exercise, that you don't have the same kind of loading. If the goal is to improve function, then I think we need to have more testing. That's kind of what this training study that my students do. We know that resistance training can be beneficial, but she's going to try to look at, well, what if we have a lighter load, something that we think might increase adherence or less frequency because time is an issue, then can we still have the same benefits? And so other types of exercise, I don't know the literature and the type of exercise that you're doing, but this you have to ask the same questions. That I have no doubt that functional gains are possible, but but specifically, is there a change in muscle mass? But I guess what I'm trying to say is that's not the only thing that can improve or affect changes in quality of life or changes in overall health. And the same is true for, this GFAL study also incorporates some cardiovascular training. Well, I think the literature is fairly clear, although it has some kind of controversy, that a certain amount of intensity in that kind of aerobic training is required if you want to have the benefits in terms of cardiovascular benefits. But that is not, and so I believe that message, but that is not to discourage someone saying, I cannot get that intensity. Does that mean if I can just do a low level intensity, there's no point? I might as well just not bother? No, there are lots of other benefits that you can get from accumulation of much lower intensity exercise or different type of resistance training exercise.
Equivalency at all for the exercises. So you're just saying this is what we take you. Sit-ups is one, but then there's an equivalency of the exercises in terms of resistance and endurance to actually maintain or to create or actually have improved muscle mass and function.
Well, you're scaring me a little bit by asking me to address equivalency. Now I'm afraid to say that there could be something that's equivalent, but I will say that there could be benefits exactly with that type of exercise. Yes.
Okay.
Does that mean that there has to be a greater volume? Does that mean that the same magnitude of changes in muscle mass? But what I'm trying to say is that you still can have benefits in terms of function, and that is also important.
The question has to do basically with whether strength training that builds bone mass has to be done on all the bones, or is it a systemic benefit? In other words, if you do a lot of walking, but not much up here, does whatever the benefit for bone health that happens in your leg bones transfer to the bones, say, in your spine or your arms? Is it systemic or is it local?
That's a good question. I'm going to give it a shot, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Johnson here, who has her research in bone health, who probably can give you a more specific answer. But this is a good question because it's, the opposite is true, where there's the myth that if you do 1 million sit-ups, you're going to lose fat in your stomach. Where we say, well, if you think about how that happens, how do you mobilize fat? You increase exercise. You do aerobic exercise, you increase caloric expenditure, you mobilize fat stores wherever they are, and you're able to oxidize them so that you don't lose fat preferentially. If you do a bunch of bicep curls, you don't have less fat in your arm. But the opposite is true in terms of specific sites when you're doing resistance type training. That if I do leg extension exercise, I'm going to improve strength in my quadriceps. I'm not going to improve strength in my arm because I did leg extension exercise. You do have to perform the exercise on the limb, on the muscle group that you're using.
I can see that for the muscle, but
yeah.
what about the bone?
Yeah, so that said,
the whole metabolism.
so I will venture out and say that in terms of the idea of mechanical loading and the same thing that the effect that the muscle has in terms of putting a strain on the bone, that you need to be exercising that muscle and that bone. On the other hand, I've also been talking about metabolism. We didn't get into calcium and vitamin D and some of these changes.
Yes.
And so there's, just as muscle, I said protein synthesis is a continual thing, so too is bone remodeling is continually happening. And so muscle has receptors for vitamin D. Vitamin D plays an important role in calcium homeostasis. So potentially you improve that. I'm going to ask Andrew to jump in, but I would imagine if you improve that store, improve your calcium homeostasis, that might lend itself to less leaching of the calcium, etc., from bone. There could be a global effect, but I'm guessing it would be small.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like, if you're doing leg exercises, for example, you're putting the mechanical load on bones of your legs. But when you're doing a leg exercise, you're also working your back, right? You know, when you're sitting and doing a leg exercise, the muscles in your back are affecting the bones in your back too. Whether that affects the bones in your wrist, for example, I am not sure per se. I would say that you probably need to do more arm exercises or wrist exercises to affect the bones in your wrist. But definitely the core muscles and the core back muscles, when you're working large muscle groups like in your legs, for example, you're going to affect those bones around whatever muscles are being worked. So yeah, there definitely is benefit for other areas with respect to bone. But for smaller bone areas, like your wrists, for example, which, you know, it's definitely a site where bone is often lost with respect to osteoporosis, you may want to do some particular wrist exercises in order to strengthen your wrists. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, my understanding with osteoporosis, if you're also talking about not just resistance training, but weight-bearing exercise, so walking. I mean, that's a big thing, is walking. And the studies that I'm aware of is that walking does not provide enough benefit for the thoracic region, but that's where a lot of people they'll have osteoporosis in the neck of the femur. Often it's the thoracic spine, but that the impact doesn't translate up hard enough because it's not enough of a force to generate that much. So you have to do exercises.
Unless you're incorporating something else.
Yes, exactly. But a lot of people just do walking, and then they have a bone densities tested, and they don't see much improvement. They're usually losing, but they either don't walk hard enough, and that's a hard message to get across to people. That it's not a stroll; it's going to be a really fast walk, and it needs to be on concrete or pavement, so there is impact. But that force will help the neck of the femur, but it won't do much for the thoracic spine because it's just too distal. You know, it's too far from that site. So then it's when you need very specific, to get around that area.
Could you extend that a bit by bringing in exercises done in water?
Mm-hmm. No, not for osteoporosis. Well, the resistance part, but not the weight bearing. There's no impact.
It's not weight bearing when you're in the water.
Exactly.
In the water is not going to do it.
It's almost like a lot of studies you might be familiar with, even in kids now. I mean, I don't know about in aging, but jumping, but some studies have shown that doing 5 jumps a day during peak bone growth sort of results in a difference in younger age. So it is this pounding.
Yeah.
The
trouble is if you're at an osteoporotic state, it's sort of a catch-22 because you need higher impact to strengthen the bone. If you're not doing resistance training, the impact is going to help. But if the bone is so porous that you're at a fracture risk, like you're say minus 2.5 and less, then you can snap the bone, right? So, and then you're talking a lot of pain and disability. So it's the sort of thing that if you can do it sooner than later, because women, it's really the onset of menopause is really where the
Prevention.
Yeah, sure.
I also think that a key phrase for osteoporosis that is being thrown around is this term resistive exercise. So it's not necessarily resistance, like, you need to be in a machine per se, or lifting barbells that are quite heavy, or do this in a gym facility. But we did talk a little bit about bands and soup cans and using your own body weight, for example, to be able to facilitate resistive type exercise, which is not as high impact per se as going to the gym, for example, but you do still achieve those benefits.
Because you can direct it to that area, like especially resistance bands. I mean, you can basically do any exercise with a resistance band that you could do with a dumbbell or something like that, but it's certainly much safer, and it's also because a lot of retired people travel.
Yes.
They're not going to throw dumbbells into their suitcase, but they can take resistance bands with them.
Baggage costs.
Walking and arthritic themes. What's a good idea to have these replaced and keep on walking?
If someone has the answer to that, I would.
I've got
because I've got arthritis in my knees.
That's where the non-weight exercises exercises may be
Beneficial.
That's sometimes where non-weight bearing exercises may be helpful, like walking in the pool, for example. Using an elliptical as opposed to a pounding treadmill, because it works on a different mechanism. Obviously, if you have osteoarthritis in your knee, it's hard to walk. But doing exercise that can help the cardiovascular system and in turn stimulate the muscle just by moving it, for example, these non-weight bearing exercises I would recommend to be better for people with osteoarthritis.
And things like the elliptical, I mean, I think there has been work done on exactly that you're not actually, your feet aren't coming off the ground, and it still is an aerobic type of activity. Not only is less strain on the knee or individuals with osteoarthritis in their shoulder, same thing if they're doing different kinds of exercise, but it helps improve some muscular endurance. And then people find that when they are trying to do some other things, that it's less painful, that they improve.
If the muscle itself is stronger, if the muscle is stronger, it's going to support the joint. So that's where resistance training is going to help anybody with arthritis. Even if they're in a painful state, they may have to modify it. But if your quadriceps are really weak, your thigh muscles, then every time you bend your knee, you don't have that help from the muscles. So the knee is doing a lot more loading than just opening or closing. So this is where, again, bigger muscles are going to actually help the arthritis. It's just getting there can be the tricky part, because if you're in a painful or flared state, you're not going to feel like exercising, right?
And even in terms of resistance type of exercises, there are differences. It might be more painful to do something like the leg extension that's so frequently used in a lot of studies, and a leg press might be less, or might be more beneficial. These kinds of things. So there are lots of, again, modifications, and the longer that someone has arthritis, then the less likely they are to exercise. Then the more muscle atrophy you have around the knee, and probably get the greatest benefits from incorporating some of these exercise suggestions.
Can I ask a question? What about stretching exercise? Sit on the floor like something like yoga, sitting on the floor like stretching, and I find they help me. Like a muscle, like a thing. I'm sorry.
That's right. They're certainly good for pain management. They're not strengthening a muscle.
Like the muscle stretched out,
Right.
I find how neat because 2 years ago I tore my hamstring muscles, and I learned so much about my muscle. It was very good.
Yeah.
But
you learned the hard way.
Yeah, I learned the hard way. But I had learned so much knowledge about my bone and my muscle. And when my toe muscle, the hamstring tore, I couldn't walk. I said, what happened to my leg now? So it's all related, right? My muscle and bones. The muscle pulling out the bone, the upstraightening the bone activities. I think that's what it is.
Well, with stretching itself, it's not really that you're putting enough stress on the bone. You're actually just trying to bring that muscle back to its natural state. Because during resistance training, you're actually contracting the muscle, so you're making it shorter. So you want to stretch that out afterwards. But from my understanding, flexibility exercises are not going to provide enough strain or a good stress on the bone to make it stronger. It's just a matter of restoring the muscle, and I may be wrong, but
That's
to
true.
its natural
But
state.
they do play, depending on, I mentioned a couple of functional tests, and it's the $100 million question, which functional test are you going to use to determine if there's improvement? And some of these tests, I don't want to say are limited, but they're certainly affected by range of motion. So a person has a limitation in a range of motion, and these kind of things could be beneficial in terms of
So good for injury prevention.
Yeah, and it's funny because even though flexibility hasn't been pushed enough in the latest Canada Physical Activity Guidelines. It's kind of been dropped off, especially for older adults, because it used to be in the old guidelines. But I certainly know from an anecdotal standpoint, with all the clients I have and classes that I teach, everybody benefits from stretching. And people will swear by it from a pain management standpoint, that if their muscles feel really contracted, everything else just seems to hurt, so it helps relax them, and so I think it's certainly a valid thing to include. Okay.
Can I ask you one question? Now, how to get involved with this study thing you're talking about?
Well, I'm excited because this is exactly, I wanted to generate this excitement of the GFAL building coming, but now I'm left saying, I'm not quite sure exactly when it's coming, but I promise it's coming.
Is the website, I can look into it?
It will definitely be posted on my website when it comes, but it will be broadly announced. It will go through this center, it will go through the Academic Retiree Center, it will be.
So do you need participants?
Absolutely, there will be a time for needing participants, but I don't, at this stage, can't even tell you a date. I'm fairly confident on the dates of my graduate student training. That's a much smaller scale study as opposed to this program that also has the educational component.
So maybe you give me your website phone number
Sure.
later.
Is it possible for people to do both studies?
Of course it's
Do you
possible.
study first and then followed by the?
That's right.
Good point.
Have you any experience with the effects of these statin drugs like Crestor and Lipitor on the muscle? Because I've been told if you get acute pain in your muscle when you start taking it, then obviously it's going to have an effect when you stop taking it. But if you just feel general fatigue in your muscles when you're taking this, is it sufficient to really, should you really stop it or is there any effect on it?
I'm not comfortable venturing.
Talk to your doctor.
Yes, that would be my strong recommendation.
But statins, the Crestor, those statins are being looked at a lot right now by doctors, so that's the time to talk to your doctor because it is being questioned whether people need to be on them as much, or sometimes people are put on them earlier maybe than they need to, but yeah, this is a good time to find out if your doctor's
if you have any concerns about your health.
So you're kind of teaching, are you involved with the university?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming.
Interesting, thank you very much.
I appreciate you coming.
You're late already, I guess.
Well, I'd like to say thank you very much to Dr. Amara for coming today and doing our talk, and it was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the questions and the discussion.
Very educational.
Sir,